Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the sixth chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, the title being Information in War. The text follows. By the word information we denote all the knowledge which we have of the enemy and his country. Therefore, in fact, the foundation of all our ideas and actions. Let us just consider the nature of this foundation, its want of trustworthiness, its changefulness, and we shall soon feel what a dangerous edifice war is, how easily it may fall to pieces and bury us in its ruins. For although it is a maxim in all books that we should trust only certain information, that we must be always suspicious, that is only a miserable book comfort, belonging to that description of knowledge in which writers of systems and compendiums take refuge for want of anything better to say. Great part of the information obtained in war is contradictory, a still greater part is false, and by far the greatest part is of a doubtful character. What is required of an officer is a certain power of discrimination, which only knowledge of men and things and good judgment can give. The law of probability must be his guide. This is not a trifling difficulty even in respect of the first plans which can be formed in the chamber outside the real sphere of war, but it is enormously increased when in the thick of war itself one report follows hard upon the heels of another. It is then fortunate if these reports, in contradicting each other, show a certain balance of probability, and thus themselves call forth a scrutiny. It is much worse for the inexperienced when accident does not render him this service, but one report supports another, confirms it, magnifies it, finishes off the picture with fresh touches of color, until necessity in urgent haste forces from us a resolution which will soon be discovered to be folly, all those reports having been lies, exaggerations, errors, etc., etc. In a few words, most reports are false, and the timidity of men acts as a multiplier of lies and untruths. As a general rule, everyone is more inclined to lend credence to the bad than the good. Everyone is inclined to magnify the bad in some measure, and although the alarms which are thus propagated like the waves of the sea subside into themselves, still like them without any apparent cause they rise again. Firm in reliance of his own better convictions, the chief must stand like a rock against which the sea breaks its fury in vain. The role is not easy. He who is not by nature of a buoyant disposition or trained by experience in war and matured in judgment may let it be his rule to do violence to his own natural conviction, by inclining from the side of fear to that of hope. Only by that means will he able to preserve his balance. This difficulty of seeing things correctly, which is one of the greatest sources of friction in war, makes things appear quite different from what was expected. The impression of the senses is stronger than the force of the ideas resulting from methodical reflection, and this goes so far that no important undertaking was ever yet carried out without the commander having to subdue new doubts in himself at the time of commencing the execution of his work. Ordinary men who follow the suggestions of others become, therefore, generally undecided on the spot. They think that they have found circumstances different from what they had expected, and this view gains strength by their again yielding to the suggestions of others. But even the man who has made his own plans, when he comes to see things with his own eyes, will often think he has done wrong. Firm reliance on self must take him proof against the seeming pressure of the moment. His first conviction will in the end prove true, when the foreground scenery which fate has pushed onto the stage of war, with its accompaniments of terrific objects, is thrown aside and the horizon extended. This is one of the great chasms which separate conception from execution. Very important chapter, as always, that deals with information in war, which is of dramatic importance not just for the concept of friction, of fog of war that will be developed by von Clausewitz ahead, but in general for our, for testing and assessing and evaluating our cognitive limits and our intrinsic bias, fundamentally deriving from the incomplete character of our knowledge, of our understanding, that instinctively makes us lean towards certain directions rather than others. So von Clausewitz here is posing the accent actually on this exception of information, because it says, by the word information we denote all the knowledge which we have of the enemy and his country, right? Therefore, in fact, the foundation of all our ideas and actions, right? So this goes back straight to the concept of reciprocity, for which we basically don't act in a, in war, in a situation where we don't have anything but our own, the knowledge of our own forces and of ourselves to fall upon, but also what the enemy is doing, and his country, that here I suspect is the country in general, of course, because it's not just about a war of invasion, but realizing that in fact what the enemy knows, for example, about the place where he stands is generally more accurate than our own at that given moment, especially, and more generally reflecting on the importance that really the enemy forces have for the development of our plans, our ideas, our actions during the conduct of war. Von Clausewitz goes on and says, let us just consider the nature of this foundation, its want of trustworthiness, its changefulness, and we shall soon feel what dangerous edifice war is, how easily it may fall to pieces and bury us in its ruins. So here the edifice of war is fundamentally what we build on, right? This knowledge that we have just highlighted, and we realize that this knowledge, by the nature of his own foundation, is lacking trustworthiness, is changefulness, and it is changeable, and therefore it is intrinsically dangerous, right? We basically, as von Clausewitz says, I repeat it all the times, 3/4 of all the action that is taken in war is based on the unknown. So basically we act upon something that is less than half of the truth of what, at least, the truth meant, for what, in this sense, in a broader way, meaning things we can know for approximately for what the conduct of war really wants. So here von Clausewitz is stressing the catastrophical potential that war always has inherently in itself, the realization that we operate constantly in a situation that can degenerate into a disaster, right? So this is very strong to assess, of course, but it's of dramatic importance for understanding war in general, right? It seems to me that generally when we think about war in popular culture, in certain, I can't say just civilian contexts, but broadly speaking, at war as an activity, we rarely connect it to the objective uncertainty that the military action has within itself, right? So it's this idea of, well, okay, this war is gonna be easy fundamentally. We can do it. We can bomb here, go there. Here I'm not referring to any power whatsoever. I'm really, because this is valid for every single war. This is the geniality of von Clausewitz. The understanding that war is constantly one step ahead from catastrophe, one step, away from catastrophe, and it is constantly, right? There's not a moment in which you are, even if you have a dramatic advantage, let's say, there is not a single moment in which this peril disappears. Things can always go in a completely different way from the one you had foreseen. There is a situation that is constantly changing, that is evolving, and information in this sense is what we have to rely on, right? Because reality goes on by itself. Even when there are these two combatants that fundamentally still swim in this unknown, but they're still acting and they're still operating. They're making changes, right? There are things that objectively make the situation evolve constantly, right? The situation evolves constantly, even when you're idling, right? You consume energies, resources. Everything is subject to the environment, to several changes, and we're not talking about the political side of the story. It is not just the two combatants, but also whatever surrounds them, not just militarily, in fact, but politically, and always remembering that war is nothing else but continuation of war, of policy with other means, right? So this is so important because it's a great warning. It's really a shout for, stay sharp. Like, always consider that this thing cannot be resolved whatsoever. That the best way you can do is never to be content with what you have, but always remaining in alert, right, for whatever it happens. And defeat, or at least a brutal turn of events, will kind of always take place. Here, Von Clausewitz says it afterwards, if you remember. It says basically no great military enterprise has these moments of, first of all, of great risk, but also, in fact, of, moments in which you have to, things change suddenly, and you can't really do much about it, unless trying to cope with them on some sort of precautions that you had taken, or at least with some sort of understanding it. Now, von Clausewitz will also discuss, right? So information here is lacking trustworthiness. It's always changing, right? And it keeps arriving. Like, information never ceases to arrive, because also in here it's nothing impersonal. The whole thing is the information is filtered by other people who bring it to you, who communicate it to you, and most of this information is unreliable. The filtering process has loaded it with some extra considerations and subjective perceptions that definitely do not help. People understand things differently. The sources of information can be different in this sense. So it's that complicated, and we must realize that nobody can solve this equation in the first place. So if you are willing to go to war, you have to know, in any case, that that's where the dimension which you're gonna swim through, right? And there is no way out of it. But following certain paths that do not really grant you the certainty of victory, but can help you to reduce damage, or this side effects, let's say, that are so impacting, let's say, and continuously on your ability to wage war itself, right? So yeah, and always remembering that you react upon an independent body, right? The enemy is, it's not quite independent broadly meant, because it's still depending on you in turn, but you're interdependent. So you're doing something, you have someone who reacts to it actively, right? There's thinking a way to defeat you in a way or another, right? So von Clausewitz goes on and says, for although it is a maxim in all books that we should trust only certain information, that we must be always suspicious, that is only a miserable comfort belonging to that description of knowledge in which writers of systems and compendiums take refuge for want of anything better to say. This phrase is also very, very important, and if you realize it, sometimes on Schwerpunkt we do say maybe, well, always be careful about things you know, always suspect, always be healthily skeptical about the information you process, etc., and that you can go through, but here von Clausewitz is criticizing essentially by putting the accent on a side of the story that really doesn't solve the problem in terms of, figuring out what is that really you don't know, because you can't know that, largely. But he's always telling you, never basically lower the guard by saying, at this point I can't know about this, and I should always be suspicious about everything, and therefore I can even maybe not really give up, but stopping there by saying I don't know. Always think that there is a way through that, potentially, that you can always do something better, right? So this is a very important perspective, because in not much from a strictly military point of view, because hopefully who deals with military stuff should know these things as a base. If anything, that's why we read von Clausewitz, because that's really the base. But here it's probably stressing the political responsibility that derives from choosing war. Explain myself better. If you basically say, okay, this thing is difficult to know, and you simply say, well, okay, let's leave it there, you're simply giving up, right? And it's normal. I mean, it happens. It's like I was saying before, like with Schwerpunkt. Obviously, nobody can be expert about everything. I'm evidently not, but we talk about many things on Schwerpunkt, and sometimes I simply say, I don't know much about this. Like, I don't know, and much actually of our historical knowledge is really, historiographically speaking, kind of debatable. But simply because there can be a further inquiry to be carried on it. That's what von Clausewitz is telling us, because when we get to the topic of information, thinking about today's problems in this sense, fake news, etc., you realize that there is a deep political significance behind them, right? If you there is, let's say, a side of this problem that is basically pushing on confusion and chaos to disorient people, so that they can say, oh well, you know what, they lie both from one side and the other, so you know what, I just pick the one that I feel like it's the best, and that's how I go on. And there were, let's say, political sides throughout the whole spectrum that push for this strategy, because it's very, very interesting. Let's say it's very convenient for anyone to make the least effort to try to understand the world we live in. But if you basically say, well, you know what, everybody lies, you basically you throw away your own responsibility. You give up your own responsibility, because you're basically saying, I don't care, right? I do not investigate on it, which is plausible, because as I was saying before, nobody can do it fully ever about everything. Just to study certain topics about current politics or just about history takes a whole lifetime for understanding decently an extremely tiny part of the whole thing we should know in this sense. But you can still make a dramatic improvement in general, given the potential we have, if you only by not giving up the idea that you can know, right? And believe me, it's usually dictatorships and totalitarian regimes that tell you, you have been betrayed. Like, you're the guy, you are the exploited, you're the guys who have, that the world owes something to. And that's the best way to lead people to pretend that they are somehow important, they're somehow aware or intelligent, or and the only consequence of it is a step ahead towards dogmatism and irrationality, right? And this is largely what is happening today. We give up understanding for simply saying, I pick a side, and then I stay there, and I don't care. For now I stop here. Then maybe I will learn. But for now I just took this position. You should never really be like that. You should always doubt, but knowing that there is always a truth, and you can't do without pretending that there is not in the first place, because that means surrendering every responsibility, right? And when it comes to political problems and as war, etc., you realize that this is of dramatic importance. How many wars have been ill decided fundamentally? How much public opinion has, for example, influenced or backed, however, this certain terrible political and military decisions countless times, and it's always been so. And so there is also this very strong relation that von Clausewitz identifies in the Trinity, naturally between the two elements of the Trinity, between the people, say, and policy, for which the people is actually the one that reasons the most with its own stomach, right? Not much. It doesn't use much of an intelligence, especially as the broad mass, right? And kind of delegates these more rational calculations to policy that knows to how to exploit it fundamentally. So this is great for it. So von Clausewitz is putting us in guard and saying, always beware that when people say, well, we can't really know, never fully trust them, or at least know that, of course, sometimes it is true, because sometimes there are things we cannot know, or at least we don't know yet. So at that point you have to give up. But sometimes it's presented as if it was basically surrendering, we simply can't go beyond. Never trust people who say this. Never think that there is not even a tiny thing more that you can say, you can process in the broader picture to further improve its understanding. And I must confess that it's a pretty effective rhetorical artifice to say, oh, well, we can't know, so it's difficult. Be skeptic, end of the story. Well, it's never satisfying. So that's actually, I must confess, one of the one of the driving forces for learning new things on my own, right? Because I've never been much content about other people's answers, right? Even right now that I went ahead, I've been researching certain stuff new, and I realized that great part of what is also taught is effectively inaccurate, right? You can't say wrong, because also saying, everything that has been written before is wrong, is false. Telling the truth, coming back on certain, even outdated historiography, I found some sound points that, after all, were criticized a bit with the, obviously inadequate perspectives that have changed because of new evidence that has been found, etc. But that were sacrificed in this sense, but that otherwise were quite good, and that we're tending to forget, because it seems that the way history is told right now also starts to follow certain agendas more than the strict narratives, right? The narrative requires to be a good one, like a convincing one, something that really has a sense, and that you can and you should stress in this sense as as the right explanation, if you want, right? This aspect of the story, however, having a writing here, it makes you realize that all narratives, of course, are wrong in approximately as much as they're right approximately, and that much, however, of this differential, let's say, you can find for criticizing them actually stands in the premises that you set, right? And of course, you can be wrong yourself, never think that someone has never been there before you in some ways, but at the same time, it's really also a matter of how you pose yourself the question, right? And this in war is particularly evident because, as von Clausewitz teaches us, war is the human activity that in absolute terms has the greater degree of unpredictability, right? So war is basically the plan, the dimension in which really the greatest changes can happen, and therefore obliges you to think in many directions at once. So it takes more intelligence to understand it, and also to, it's definitely difficult to exercise sometimes even on it. So I believe military history in this sense is the most complicated and also the largest social science that exists in absolute terms. I mean, I can't think of another one that comes really close to this degree of complexity, but at the same time it teaches you to doubt, yes, but in a healthy way, like in a critical way, for which paradoxically, by being skeptical, you reach certain conclusions that paradoxically are more objective, that are, closer probably to what concretely the matter is about. And believe me, because there are certain fields, even of human sciences, that they are also very close to history, like anthropology, like there are many in this sense, even sociology, etc., and that are very, in which there are very dogmatic fights more than else. I can't say they're dogmatic themselves, because at this point the tendency is the complete opposite, like basically demolishing everything that has ever been built, experimentally speaking, as a structure of interpretation, as a pattern interpretation. But in this sense, also in many ways, the battle is not much over the evidence, but rather over the systems of interpretation, and those are pretty nasty ones. Military history has this great advantage of showing you a reality that is surprisingly homogeneous, if you want, which seems strange, because we just said that is the realm in which things can go in the most different ways, yes, but they go at the same time on patterns that you can track. If you have an experience about it, you can follow. This is, I think, the greatest thing of the history of warfare, that and that von Clausewitz really helps you to understand, is that that war is only one, historically. There are not as many wars as the ones that have been fought, right? War is always the same one. So if you know about the 30 Years' War, you can, and you should, know about the Peloponnesian War, right? If you know about, I don't know, let's say, the Crusades, in terms of military history, you should know about World War I in military history, and being able to understand it. And I don't know how developed these concepts are, because I also come from a tradition that actually stresses much more the importance of sources rather than historiography. I must say I have a deep bias towards historiography, partly also because I'm not a great fan, like I'm an ignorant about it. I don't like historiography very much. I've read naturally many books, not just sources. Obviously it would be impossible, but tendentially I don't believe that the first approach should come through historiography. At least it should come at the same time, because at the same you can't do anything but reading sources and historiography at the same time. But let's say that there is sometimes a reverence towards historiography in itself that really stems more from maybe academic prestige rather than actual effectiveness, right? And I realized that in different parts of the world, you can't write even a thesis, etc., if you don't pass through um, certain mechanisms that at the end of the day are leading you, especially in this phase in history, towards that hyper specialization, which is fine as long, especially if when you make research. But as we were discussing, it kind of makes you believe that it's all about that niche, right? Instead, you should widen, and it's become pretty damn tough. This is not really about me thinking about this, but just think about how many things there are to read now compared to 30 years ago or 60 years ago. Like 60 years ago, you could read just a bunch of books and having exhausted basically that field of research. Today, how many hundreds, to be lucky, of articles you should be able to read before writing a PhD thesis? Well, that's becoming dramatic, right? And one of the consequences is that you can't obviously do it, but certain systems push you to basically just go through that first and then looking at the evidence, which in my opinion doesn't quite work very well. And there are pros and cons. Like, I'm not saying you can only should start only from the sources and not caring about historiography. That's foolish, right? But this was just a note. Going on, von Clausewitz writes, great part of the information obtained in war is contradictory. A still greater part is false, and by far the greatest part is of a doubtful character. Right? Beautiful phrase, beautiful description. So great part of the information obtained in war is contradictory, which means that not only you are naturally struggling to understand what's going on, but information you receive contradicts itself, right? There are several things that are difficult to sort out, and this is every person who has been through sources, military history, knows how this works, right? You never find a battle account, for example, where every source is agreeing with the other, right? There is someone that always says a different thing, and it's normal because we all understand as human beings different things, right? And even though there is a hierarchy of sources, you should be able to correctly frame them in their context and give more, importance to certain ones rather than others. At the end of the day, that's all information you're gonna have most of the times, and you can't simply dismiss one of the sources because it says the exact opposite of the other. And also, there is a combinatory system that doesn't necessarily pay in this sense. How really? Well, you can't simply say, well, now I will, reconstruct this battle on the base of what I think it's military logic and pretending it's gone that way. If there is a blatant contradiction between the sources, you have to acknowledge it as historical datum, right? And you can't say, well, you can't do nothing about it until you find further evidence. So in war, which is a bit of the same thing, because at the end of the day you're still studying military history in the moment in which it's happening, or however in the moment in which it has already happened, like everything that we come to learn through our senses. So there is further information pouring in, right? And the evolution is and the situation is evolving at the same time. So you have this problem as a commander to deal with this diachronic transformation that is what the fate of your army and all what it entails rests upon. I mean, at least on a correct understanding of this situation. So then von Clausewitz says, still a greater part of the information is false. Right, so it's obvious that if you find two contradicting statements that are the one the opposite of the other, you say, well, one of the two must be false. One thing can't be true or false at the same time, unless of course you don't know something else, which can happen. So von Clausewitz is making you aware that not only, and this is not his opinion, he's really stating it out of sheer practice. He's telling you not only what you get is contradictory in great part, but at the same time it's also false. I mean, the majority, even more of this information as of all the one you receive is actually false. It's actually wrong, right? So this should always put you into a mode that should make you doubt most of what you receive, right? Remember what von Clausewitz has said about what you should be doing about this continuous state of uncertainty about reality at this point is that, if you have a plan, follow it, right? That's really the best you can do. Then, of course, if you obtain further evidence that the assumptions on which your plan or which your plan was based are wrong, well, change your plan. But if you start being bombarded now by lots of information, always be aware in general that these are largely false. So if you had solid reasons to go on in that direction, do not let yourself be fooled, because you're gonna be the odds are against you in informative terms. So don't judge everything at the same level, right? And then this scale, he says, great part of information obtained in word is contradictory. A still greater part is false, and by far, the greatest part is of a doubtful character. And you could actually expand to that all of your information is of doubtful character. I mean, what the hell do you know about reality in the first place? What is really going on? So everything, basically all the information you receive could be wrong, right? And here you could say, well, but if there is a enemy unit over there, either it is there or it's not. I mean, how can that be all doubtful? Well, it can be doubtful because the unit might have been there before or it was moving. You don't know about the entity of that unit. You don't know about the morale, its equipment, what it's doing there. You can't even maybe know whether that's friendly unit or an enemy unit. So you realize that this overcomplicates things at the point that you can't solve this simple equation. You can't solve equations most of the times, especially in the conditions in which you are into when under stress in war, right? So if you don't have an evidence, a clear evidence, you basically can't be sure. But at the same time, you have evidence of something, right? So it's on this something that you should be able to do something about it. So von Clausewitz goes on and says, what is required of an officer is a certain power of discrimination, which only knowledge of men and things and good judgment can give. So this is important. The officer, the commander, must have this power of discrimination, this ability to say, you know what, I don't care if most of this is actually doubtful. I have my own BS, if you want, and I believe that things are going this way. Sometimes this is actually military logic, right? If there are certain absurd things that you can't understand. It's like when just assume, I don't know, it's when from sources you read that in the ancient world there were armies of 1 million men. Well, nobody was there to see it from our own times, but I would bet everything I have on saying that there was no army with 1 million men, right? And yes, not even in the Second Persian War. So that's the real point. I mean, it's really this finesse, if you want, that you must obtain as a critical skill, right? But that is not sufficient. You must have good knowledge of your own men. It is of dramatic importance. It is essentially knowing the effectiveness of your instrument, right? This is valid, broadly speaking, to reinforce the Clausewitzian paradigm as war as a military instrument of policy, right? And things here for Clausewitz is vague, meaning theoretically of everything. Like, it helps for a good commander to know something about chemistry or literature or engineering or philosophy or anthropology to be a good commander. It may seem strange, but that's exactly how it is, right? It's not mostly about it, but there has to be a common sense that helps. So also, good education is not just worthless in this case. And also good judgment, of course. So this ability, the coup d'oeil that von Clausewitz discusses, so this ability to be quick, reactive. Just think about time and how fundamental it is, because there are obviously certain problems that over time you can come to solve, but in war you might not have that amount of time. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, the law of probability must be his guide, that is the commander's guide. This is also a point that we have seen, given that we don't know basically most of what we are doing. We have to basically bet, we have to gamble, and being open to it, so that your judgment shouldn't be much of whether what is in front of you is right. Is right or wrong, but rather how likely it is to be right and wrong, because that's really what it gets down to by definition in the first place. And believe me, this is something that we all do regularly. It's not so strange. The problem is that there are people who presume that there is a scientificity into it. But we're always biased. Unfortunately, we are biased because that's naturally a limit. But it's the same way how our brain works and how it processes information. So, if we are limited with that, we should still have to appreciate the fact that we can kind of figure out things not just through evidence, clear evidence. We don't even know what it is, but also this ability of framing, for example, a lot of data and kind of being even understanding what is a human phenomenon at the end of the day, right? We are still fighting against human beings, so it's not really someone we don't know. So von Clausewitz says then, the law of probability okay, we already said it, excuse me. I said this is not a trifling difficulty, even in respect of the first plans, which can be formed in the chamber outside the real sphere of war, but it is enormously increased when, in the thick of war itself, one report follows hard upon the heels of another, right? So, and then he says, it is then fortunate if these reports, in contradicting each other, show a certain balance of probability, and thus themselves call for the scrutiny, right? So there is this situation which, as we were saying, it makes a lot of difference whether in war things are, under a certain amount of pressure or not, just like in reality. So you can solve problems, at a distance, not just of space, but even of time sometimes. But when you're there and you have to take action, well, matters are very different, and it's definitely a very lucky event when the reports actually follow a good, let's say, a plausible story, right? You don't have to struggle particularly to understand, always bearing in mind that it's possible that even everything is kind of wrong. But it's rare, for example, that everything that you receive is kind of wrong. And here von Clausewitz writes on a very important thing. He says, it is much worse for the inexperienced when accident does not render him this service. But one report supports another, confirms it, it magnifies it, finishes off the picture with fresh touches of color, until necessity in urgent haste forces from us a resolution which will soon be discovered to be folly. All those reports having been lies, exaggerations, errors, etc., etc. So also in here, that's where discrimination and good judgment come into use, because, you know, it's rare, evidently, that a general picture is so simple, right? It's some of the greatest victories that have ever been achieved. Some of the greatest commanders. Think about Austerlitz, or there are naturally based on deception, are based on giving a kind of coherent and plausible picture of yourself, for example, to the enemy. All right, and this is naturally a strategy, but it's also something you should be prepared to let's say to see carried out by the enemy against you. So the inexperienced has sometimes this, there can be these patterns, these narratives that in the reports can filter, right? But they can be mistakes. So the inexperienced will simply tend to say, okay, well, now I know this stuff is kind of true or probable or likely, and how many danger there can be into it. And then he falls into it perfectly, and then he realizes that it was wrong too late, and everything crumbles. Remember the catastrophe that von Clausewitz is talking about. So how this edifice of war is so precariously built, and how it can be destroyed and rebuilt every time in the base of how things change, right? Then von Clausewitz writes, in a few words, most reports are false, and the timidity of man acts as a multiplier of lies and untruths. So here you can really smell the human flavor. Here you can understand that fear and undecisiveness acts as a multiplier of lies and untruths, right? How many times, for good faith, for not causing further attrition, for example, you say something wrong that ultimately doesn't help the person, and you wish you had been more honest about it, even though you were trying just to do something positive. Well, this happens many times, and naturally, when everybody's stressed out and things are very difficultly, let's say, reasonable because of the situation that is going on, the idea is that these difficulties increase dramatically, right? So it's also a matter of responsibility, because remember here it's a great gamble. So people know that they can fail basically all times. This is not a dimension in which basically it's normal to guess things right at the first time. Here, and there are big responsibilities also in terms of name and pride and honor. Military history is full of these contracts among the same officers, so this is also a great problem. So most reports are false, and this is also increased, however, by a strictly human problem. That is that you should also be able to understand the psyche of man, right? You can't just be saying, okay, well, I simply passively received this information from a completely unbiased source that simply copied what it received from who knows or what knows what. These are men communicating to you and judging, already making some sort of discrimination in the process and judgment in the process. So this information is already filtered and we all know how, that there is a big difference between first-hand, second-hand, etc. information, right? So there things are slowly changed time after time. And von Clausewitz, in fact, states brilliantly, as a general rule, everyone is more inclined to lend a credence to the bad than the good. This is also very precious, because here it's not really a matter of overconfidence, right? It's sometimes the opposite. It's really fear that things are gonna go wrong, right? So that's why resolution is so important as a form of courage, because war, tendentially, in order to make the right choice, or at least the one that follows a military logic, etc., does require constantly to go beyond an instinctive assessment that is usually rendering a worse picture than the one that it already is, or at least that is picturing in potential something much more disastrous consequences that they're often out there, which is instinctive and is normal, right? We all make problems kind of bigger than they are, tendentially, because we tend to avoid them naturally. We don't want to get into problems in the first place, so this sometimes holds us in a way that we don't really we're rarely frozen, because we don't know what to do, because we fear to make mistakes. But eventually, in the way we're built, biologically speaking, we are brought to let's say to take action in spite of all, right? So a bit of foolishness is necessary to take action, right? It takes a lot of foolishness. So if to act in a dimension in which 3/4 of what you need to know is unknown, there is a risk inherent to it. So it's perfectly understandable. Von Clausewitz writes, everyone is inclined to magnify the bad in some measure. And although the alarms which are thus propagated like the waves of the sea subside into themselves, still, like them, without any apparent cause, they arise again. So we are not really ever devoid of such alarms, right? They're constant. They arrive at all times. Naturally, there is an increase or decrease in terms of the pressure, of the risk, but also of the importance in this sense of what we are doing. But we're never devoid of them, right? There is always some sort of risk at all times that we must accept or come to terms or cope with, whatever you want to define it. That if you want to take certain action, you have to go through, right? And this is very important also socially speaking, right? It's usually more aggressive and, let's say, bolder and even more, less agreeable people that in society tend to go to rise to positions of power and of leadership, exactly because of this, because they are the subjects, the individuals that are more inclined to take action in spite of it. Who cares? So there is an intrinsic hierarchy also, socially speaking, that is what produces also the military as an instrument of policy, right? And with a hierarchy, it's no surprise, in fact, that the military is disciplined by martial law. It's so strictly hierarchical, and it functions exactly in this very this colder way, because it's theoretically based exactly on this ideas, and that's a rationalization. Really, there is nothing crude about it. It's really how it should be, and that's how all human civilizations produce their military like, and that's also the greatness of military history and Clausewitzian theory, in this sense, because it makes you understand that we are all talking at the end of the day of the same thing, basically. So that you can use some patterns of interpretation also if you want to study military history on this base. And this expands to many other things like combat, like, organic units are not really conventional. They're all functional to what human hierarchies on the field really work like. And by the way, also discipline is about this. Discipline is about, just do it. So if you want, it's a form of individual recklessness, because, who would go under enemy fire willingly? But we train soldiers in this way because we know that that's paradoxically the best way to make the whole machine work, and it's counterintuitive, right? So that's why sometimes there is this cultural resistance to understand war sometimes, because we see into something really foolish to do. But it turns out that's how we even solve things like National Socialism, for example, that it was not really a bad thing to do, I would say. So we need the military exactly for this, and the greatness of the Clausewitzian theory is about this. Is realizing that we need a military, and that especially it's not really a matter of needing it, organizationally speaking, etc., but it's also about the fact that all human societies with a certain level of development that at this point are to be found basically all over the world cannot do without the military option, right? I mean, theoretically, imaginifically, we can think of a world without armies, right? Without weapons, but that wouldn't take away human aggressiveness and conflictuality and the military option out of the instruments of policy. So it's better to have the military and to cultivate a good political culture, because that's what can establish a healthy relation between the two and avoid the system to degenerate. And don't think that this last thing is to be given for granted, that it won't happen. It's pretty strange. It's like kind of miraculous, the fact that we achieved at this point in history a certain degree of stability and of pacification at the end of the day, and peacefulness, let's say. That is something nobody seems to appreciate very much, right? Up to up to 70 years ago, the whole world was at war, and how do you deal with that? What about now? Do you think that this happens just because you can use your smartphones and doing nothing else in your life, staying logged to Twitter or Facebook? That's not really it. You should cultivate civic education and a democratic culture in order to ensure that this system doesn't go backwards which is a realistic possibility, by the way. I mean, we don't need to be extremely we don't need to be catastrophistic about it, but it's still an option. Also, this is not really out of the range of possibilities, right? Okay, and then von Clausewitz goes on and says, firm in reliance of his own better convictions, the chief must stand like a rock against which the sea breaks its fury in vain. There's this beautiful, really romantic pictures in von Clausewitz. You see that there is this continuous waves of danger, right? So the chief must stand like a rock against which, all these fake news, because these are literally fake news, basically break themselves in their fury in vain. Von Clausewitz was endowed with a particular, very deep poetical vein. By the way, and it's so effective, right? Read. The chief must stand like a rock against which the sea breaks its fury in vain, right? The sea of waves of alarm, right? And the term fury it's really realistic. Just think about how fake news really work. They are furious most of the times. They have this outraged tone, and they're targeting. They're really hoping you're gonna lose your mind about it, right? They're really trying to entice your more emotionalistic side, not your reason, which is what you should use in this situation. And von Clausewitz assesses that the role is not easy. He who is not by nature of a buoyant disposition or trained by experience in war and matured in judgment may let it be his rule to do violence to his own natural conviction by inclining from the side of fear to that of hope. Only by that means will he be able to preserve his balance, right? So never also always remain balanced in this sense. Never be too bold, never be too timid, right? Always try to follow reason more than else. And even if you need courage to do it in the first place, and to do also something else when you take action, but still judge. And now we will see also the moment of conception and execution in a while. What's the difference? Okay, then he goes on and says, this difficulty of seeing things correctly, which is one of the greatest sources of friction in war, makes things appear quite different from what was expected. So it's very clear, self-explanatory. There is this different picture of reality, right? What you presume is reality. That always remains so you have to basically try to read through it at the end of the day. So it's a multi-dimensional and possibly infinitely dimensional picture, right? There is not a real center, right? There is not a real orientation. It is, you have to get through it through experience, to sheer practice sometimes. Most of the times, actually, if you want to command proper. And especially it is different from what it was expected, right? So it's not just a matter of saying, well, okay, sit here, let's see what happens. You're also taking action into it, of course, but you also had a previous understanding of what things could be like. So really, the concept is you have to struggle against your own prejudice fundamentally, which is literally a prejudice, because when you make a plan, you're basically trying to simulate what is going to happen, right? And so by default, that's a pre-judgment, right? Okay. And then von Clausewitz goes on and says, the impression of the senses is stronger than the force of the ideas. This is a very, very beautiful concept. Resulting from methodical reflection. And this goes so far that no important undertaking was ever yet carried out without the commander having to subdue new doubts in himself at the time of commencing the execution of his work. This is also a phrase of dramatic importance. So here it says that the impression of the senses, so in other words also our emotional side, is stronger than the force of the ideas resulting from methodical reflection, right? Always remember this. In von Clausewitz obviously admits, like we all do in science today, that emotions, their feelings, are stronger than reason, right? So reason has to do a freaking big effort to remain afloat into this and to subdue feelings when to make a good assessment. And remember that war here is the realm of remember the last chapter when we did this guy, I don't remember what he was, the last one. Not really, no. Well, yes, but we talk about the danger in war and of bodily exertion in war in the last two chapters. So those were aimed to stress how difficult it is to have an objective judgment, therefore a rational judgment, in the moment in which you're under so much pressure, right? Feelings emerge instinctively because your organism is telling you what the hell is going on. Put yourself, take shelter, go away, save your skin, right? And that's instead when you should say, calm down, a reason, coolly. And it's very difficult. That's why war arguably is so difficult to wage, because you're constantly under pressure, right? So you have to be aware of it. You have to be aware that where you're going into it, your reason is going to be challenged, and that's what you have to rely chiefly on, together with resolution. It's very difficult. Not everyone is made. Actually, very few of us are capable of doing it. I don't think I would be able to do it, for example. It's so difficult, so really difficult. And here Von Clausewitz says something is very meaningful that he observes also as a military historian, not just as a military man himself with a huge military experience. He says that no important undertaking was ever military undertaking, of course, was ever yet carried out without the commander having to subdue new doubts in himself at the time of commencing the execution of his work. So, in other words, you can't pretend to start something dangerous or important without having to accept the fact that things will go wrong. This is all great endeavors are like. You can't pretend everything will go well. The bigger the thing is, the more important it is, the more responsibility you have, and the more you're gonna face the risk of failure increases, right? And that's why we need, that's how the hierarchy I was talking to you before is structured. We don't live in a reality where everybody can be simply smiling and happy and sharing places of power on the base of, of complete equality. It's not possible. We do need a hierarchy that selects the people who are the best ones to cope with the situation, because you want competent people in charge. You don't want a no one sorted randomly to take responsibility for things that he even doesn't know anything about. And believe me, this is not just. It seems like today's also political debate is fundamentally based on this, right? So, and on this actually, not on this. Only a few people point this out, that it's based today towards the exact opposite, and that's why so many things are going pretty badly, in my opinion. So in other words, this implies there can't even be a perfect plan. Not just because things are going to evolve, obviously, at the moment in which the plan is going to be carried, it is carried out effectively, but also every plan, every sensible plan, contains in itself the awareness that things can go wrong, which is obvious, right? Von Clausewitz goes on and says, ordinary men who follow the suggestions of others become, therefore, generally undecided on the spot. They think that they have found circumstances different from what they had expected, and this view gains strength by their again yielding to the suggestions of others, right? This is very relatable. Um, how many times you find someone you say, well, but this person maybe is not even so special, but why is so successful? Well, many times it's really due to this. I mean, to the fact that they accept that they're gonna go through trouble, right? Which even most sensible people wouldn't like. But that paradoxically, that it's that sensibility that actually prevents you from succeeding to something, because that maybe becomes an excess of prudence, right? And so it happens very frequently that when someone is that's why also discipline is so important, because here for Clausewitz says the ordinary man, which naturally the lower you go into the ranks, into the hierarchy, are going to increase, right? In number, in average, they need discipline to obey what people tell from the upper, from the higher ranks, right? Because otherwise you can't carry out the order effectively, and that's why the military discipline is based exactly on this, because it basically is designed to correct this undecision, undecisiveness, right? Excuse me. And it's definitely tough to depend on other people's position. Just imagine, what it means in war, in combat, to receive an order that is evidently very risky because someone else has told you, and you as a subordinate, you don't actually know whether that decision was taken with all the due awareness, and you say, well, but should I risk my life now and be dead in a few time just because someone has made a choice that I don't know? The thing is, you don't have to question that. You should simply execute that. You can immediately understand here how tough that is, because it's counter instinctual. It's also sensibly foolish. And yet, that is what works at the end of the day. I mean, collectively, right? Because if we were all individuals, well, things wouldn't, and we would work just individually, we wouldn't even have a society. So not even a political system or a military one. We would simply do everything by ourselves, and there would have not been progress civilization in some ways. So, what we have built and up to now is pretty good, after all. So even if it seems to work so badly, but still, it was based on this struggle, right? The problem really is when you stop struggling, and at that point you lack that pressure, and you start thinking that you can maybe give up something, like say, oh well, but this system is kind of old, who cares? And then you realize that it was, when the troubles arrived, that you did really need competent people at the end of the day, and you gave them up for certain ideals that weren't really functional. And yet, von Clausewitz says, even here, to avoid any positivistic approach, says, but even the man who has made his own plans, so who is in charge, when he comes to see things with his own eyes, will often think he has done wrong, right? So we have seen it before. The impression of the senses is stronger than the force of the ideas, resulting from methodical reflection. So hopefully a plan is methodically reflected. And yet, the first impression is devastating, right? It's obvious, and that will bring to change your own plan, because you can't go on with that. But still, if you had a good idea, and you don't think the evidence you have in front of you is enough in this terrible stormy sea of inaccurate information, unreliable information, the best thing to do for you is to go on with your plan, paradoxically, okay, I was reflecting about this concept because here I'm not sure whether von Clausewitz deepens it further along the work, but that's still very meaningful, right? It's really based on the concept that there are certain things that work practically, empirically, so you should take that proof, let's say, as a solid one, and it works, right? So obviously this is no guarantee of victory, but it's still doing better than what you think. But also because time is important here. Sometimes it's better to make a wrong move than idling, right? It's paradoxical, but it is true at the end of the day. It's objectively true. Sometimes, most of the time probably, because really wasting time is also leaving the initiative to the enemy, and that's terrifying. That's detrimental, really. So here he's saying that even the person who is in charge is going to be, and especially I would say the person who is in charge is going to be continuously tormented that the decision was wrong in some way. So von Clausewitz writes, firm reliance on self must make him, so the commander, proof against the seeming pressure of the moment. His first conviction will in the end prove true when the foreground scenery which fate has pushed on the stage of war with its accompaniments of terrific objects is drawn aside and the horizon extended. Right? So this is also very important problems, is that you don't have to be you have to stay open. You have really to be able to reformulate everything if there is an evidence of that. This is actually how science works. Science says, we know something, then if a new thing that disproves it comes along, we simply have to take it because that's how it is. Naturally, war is a bit more complicated than that, but here von Clausewitz, exactly because it's more complicated, he's telling you, until given the information, the evidence you have is so poor, try to keep track of the whole, not of details. Not let yourself being impressed by this storm of influences of attacks, if you want, that they're attack to your intelligence, to your understanding, to your self-esteem, to your security, to your pride, to your ego in some ways, and just do what you think it is the right thing. Because when the horizon in this storm appears once again, you can see that after all you can start measuring what the outcome of it is, and to assess whether it was right or wrong. So do not try to even give a let's say, to make a hierarchy of the of problems. Like, be aware that there are problems that you can frame into a scale, right? You have to order them and always compare them with the greater goal, right? Analyze them thoroughly, never underestimate them, but give them the importance they deserve. Do not let themselves fool you, right? And von Clausewitz ends this other phrase in saying, this is one of the great chasms which separate conception from execution, right? So that's the real difference. Right? There are really two different moments. One you have to think, one you have to act, right? And they are separated, and they're important. There is a very conflictual, let's say, relation between the two things, and within the two things themselves, right? So it's not easy. Nobody says it's easy, but always understand how the mechanism works, how the two things are separated. Because the worst thing is arguably to act without having thought, for the anxiety of doing it. This is particularly evident in everything. If you plan poorly, and you simply act for the anxiety, you're gonna meet problems, and you're gonna have to deal with them. So that's why planning is so important. At the same time, it's so difficult to plan as well. So everybody seems to have this magic formulas for which if you plan well, everything's gonna go well. Yes, but how the hell do I plan, right? So that's why a lot of knowledge, a lot of preparation in general, and then you have to decide how to achieve it, is required, right? Is to be used. But always bear in mind that if you think things thoroughly and before acting, well, that's still a better way. That doesn't ensure that things are gonna succeed, but still better than simply acting without having thought, right? And also don't overthink. I mean, be realistic. Be able to assess what you can know and what you cannot know, and don't waste too much time and resources for overthinking things that at the end of the day you can't determine. Just like risk, always remember, you know what it will be like. You know only the 25%. So you have to deal with doubts, and it's normal, and you get used to it, because otherwise you're gonna go nowhere, because normally difficulties increase, and that's how people grow normally. So yeah, I guess this is the ultimate meaning of it. Okay, so for now it's all. Next time you're gonna read the 7th chapter, which is on friction in war. Things are gonna go more and more interesting. For now, I just hope that you liked this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.